The third myth I'm going to talk about is that people expect digital stuff for free and they won't pay for it. It's true that people are accustomed to getting a lot of stuff for free, but if services can offer something that consumers can get more easily by paying for it, people will certainly do so. It's just that a lot of the services that are currently offered are based on a very restricted notion of copyright, and that people, if they can get versions that approximate the thing that's being sold, they can get versions for free or for less that do that, they're going to do so. It's really incumbent upon broadcast companies and others to think about how they're making offers unique value to people in these new environments. And that means that they need to start thinking about piracy, not from a position of legal copyright, which is itself undergoing constant and iterative transformation, but from a moral position. Like, do you want to actually be in the business of suing your fans? Do you want to be in the business of shutting down circulation of your content just as if it were your legal right, when what probably you'd rather do is attract more people into the work itself? One of the problems with that phenomenon is that occasionally when, say, media objects will circulate freely, some creators will say, well, gosh, I'll circulate Veronica Mars for free, but then I'll make up money in DVD sales later, or I'll make up money selling t-shirts later, or I'll make up money in different kinds of things. Those budgets sit in different places for an organization, and so one part of the organization might be paying more so that somebody else sees a profit, and that organizations are much more siloed than nonprofits usually, and that or just groups of ordinary people. So that's kind of one of the realities of how the business of circulation works. The fourth and final myth that I'm going to deal with or talk about is the idea that Web 2 is really only about the money. Of course, the myth of it, or one of the stories we like to tell ourselves, it's for you, it's YouTube, it's user-generated content, and so forth. The reality is that our attention is what pays for the web, and that is why even if you load ad blockers into your browsers, all it does, it doesn't actually stop browsers, usually like Facebook or Google or whomever, from tracking what you do. It just tracks your awareness. It just blocks your awareness of their tracking you. The way that the web gets paid for is by your attention, and that is to say by ad sales placed around content. Again, also a transitional moment from broadcast into new media. I would, for example, gladly pay a subscription fee to Google. I love their services. I use them on a daily basis, many, many times a day. I move between the suite all the time. If I could pay X number of dollars per month for that service, I would do so in exchange for my privacy, in exchange for not having myself tracked and aggregated and created into profiles that are sold to any number of buyers. But Google is not making that available to me, probably because they can make so much more money. I imagine it's a longitudinal play, that they'll make so much more money selling that information multiple times than they would make from me as an individual user, giving them any kind of subscription fee. But our attention absolutely pays for the web. So that's how it goes. But I also want to suggest, and this is something that's not in your assigned reading but appears later in Chapter 2 in Speadable Media, they spend a lot of time, the authors do, talking about traditional economies and gift economies, and that a lot of the logic of web sharing and sharing between microgroups is a gift economy, and that when the terms of the gift economy are violated by a corporation, for example, then that's when people get angry. So, for example, the example of fan subbing, where fans of a particular show will translate that show into their own native language, assuming that a lot of the product is coming out of Hollywood. So it's translating into Chinese, or translating into whatever language, the media objects. Fans will often do that for free, and they'll do that very quickly. It is only when organizations step in and try to profit from that gift, from that act of sharing, that the terms of the exchange are violated. And the book is really eloquent about why that violation not only disrupts how things flow between communities, but also shows the extent to which traditional corporate values just are going to have to be rethought in the context of new media. Let me just go to a few key definitions. Like first, we're going to talk about participatory culture, which Jenkins and others, but particularly Jenkins, historicizes in some very beautiful ways. I would refer you to his earlier work, Convergence Culture, for some kind of the primer on that. But what he talks about and what they talk about is that scrapbookers, zine makers, comic book makers, and other fan communities shaped how discourse about their own preferred media objects circulated, and that those practices, which we can go back much further than the 19th century, but which we do associate a lot with 19th century culture, those things totally inform how we work in these new medial environments today. Jenkins and others are working hard to dispel the myth that these fan practices are new. They're not really new. They're just manifesting themselves differently in the context of Facebook, Twitter, and other social media networking sites. So I want you to think a little bit about the sharing that we do as acts of curation, that you're curating bits and bobs that you find fascinating, and you're proffering them to very particular communities that you have in mind, and that you receive information in the same way. There's some Pew data in the chapter that you read in the introduction about how more and more we are getting our news from these micro communities that we're involved with. That, like for me, I have several communities that converge in my Facebook wall, and I get lots of different information from those different micro communities, and increasingly we're going to be getting information that way. Eli Pariser has written a very beautiful book called The Filter Bubble. Pariser is the guy who started MoveOn.org in response to the Monica Lewinsky scandal during the Clinton presidency. And, Pariser believes that the danger of receiving our information just from the people that we know is, of course, it's fairly homogenous, and that we're not going to still have a common culture of shared language for discussing our problems and working them through, which we're already beginning to see manifested in the gridlock that we see in Congress. I think that's really augmented by the idea that you can select the flavor of 24-hour news you like, if you're a Fox News person or a CNN person or an MSNBC or whatever. So those sorts of funnels of information flow definitely have an impact on civic life. Another thing I'm going to talk about briefly is the notion of circulation, that for Jenkins and others, it's a hybrid model of top-down from broadcast and grassroots up. So it's some kind of interplay between those two things. I'll also say that spectatorship is a mode of reception. It's not the same as actually actively making, meaning taking media objects and remaking them, creating parodies, creating remixes, whatever. So spectatorship is largely the model that advertising is built on, the notion of passive awareness, and that, when it comes time for a high consideration purchase like a car, the ads that you've been seeing daily for the last 3 or 4 years will manifest themselves in the sorts of choices that you make as a consumer. That's the premise of advertising. It might be changing a bit in new medial environments. What else do I want to talk about? I talked a little bit about piracy and how Jenkins and others talk about the moral distinction rather than the legal distinction. I will also add that when we talk about copyright a little bit later in the semester, you'll see, that the doctrine of fair use is a four-plank doctrine, and the major question is how transformed is the object in question. Has the person transformed it enough that it's a freestanding new object? If you're interested in these subjects, I strongly recommend that you check out Larry Lessig's work. He's a constitutional law professor at Harvard now. I think he'd been at Stanford previously. He writes very accessible. He's a public intellectual. He writes very accessible work on these subjects, and he has some great TED Talks that are also totally accessible and interesting. Let's see, the final distinction I think I'll spend some time thinking about is the difference between spreadability, the subject of this book, and stickiness. Stickiness is a term that Malcolm Gladwell invented or coined to describe broadcast practices, basically, of attention. That the thing that makes an object valuable is how long someone engages it. And how many, like in aggregate, what we're doing when we look at the stickiness models, we're taking the behaviors of a lot of individuals and we're using those behaviors to determine how valuable is the advertising space that sits around it. So the more popular a thing is, the more expensive is the advertising space around it. The thing about a stickiness model, one of the flaws of using a stickiness model in a new media environment is that it doesn't account for the spreadability and the spread of ideas. And the Susan Boyle example shows that clearly, where the ratings for Britain's Got Talent was a certain number, but just the circulation on YouTube alone, not counting all the other channels, was a factor, like I think a 3 or 4 time factor increase over the broadcast numbers. So thinking a little bit about how different communication groups spread messages among themselves and between them is one way to take the stickiness model and bring spreadability as a consideration into that. Let's see. So value is accretive in a spreadability model. And one of the challenges is that you can't even always trace where things have been shared. That's always been true. I mean, the Nielsen model is an incredibly flawed model. It's it surveys a percentage of households that are watching television and then extrapolates data based on that. I don't know enough about measurement to know whether. How about this? I was going to say to know whether or not televisual viewing can be aggregated entirely, or if still Nielsen is still using sample sets. I think they are. One of the values of, say, Facebook as an advertising platform is that it can guarantee that it can count all the views and all the click-throughs, and it can count the spaces and places where it travels when it's shared. So there's a report by ComScore, which is one of the many metrics companies trying to track spreadability, that details how that works. If you're interested, I can refer you to that. Let's see if there's really anything else that I'd like us to cover before we walk out the door. I guess I'll share with you before, in an email when I send you the link to these videos. I'll also share with you this video that's circulating right now called A Conference Call, which I first saw. It's a 4-minute parody of the many, many things that can go wrong on conference calls. And I hooked into it pretty early because I'm in a group of people that really care about that and care about virtual learning environments and all that. And so I found it, and I've just been watching how it's been spread and shared. So 52,000 like 3 days ago, and now 2.6 million. So it's really just been circulating quite a lot. I think a lot of people feel like that experience talks to them. I will say that, like, my cousin, a Republican business guy, we don't typically have tons in common, but he found it hilarious too. I would say that some of my Digerati friends in marketing are very interested in it. It's touched, I can see, the many different populations that it's been circulating through. And so that's just an interesting thing to watch. I guess I invite you to shoot me questions either via email or when we get together face-to-face in G Hangout on Wednesday. Thanks for your time.